I'm making good progress on the ASR33 teletype. I've got the printer working, I've got the tape punch working, the electronics pack seems fine, so it's time to turn our attention to the tape reader. So these are fairly simple devices. They use a series of pins to determine if there's a hole in the particular row of paper tape. There are some sprung contact fingers that are used in conjunction with the pins to close or open depending on whether there's a hole in the particular row of tape, and that's just fed through to the electronics to determine what particular character is being read. There's a big solenoid on the bottom that's used to operate the pins and also used to feed the tape through the reader. Now at the moment, as you can see, this has had a fairly rough life. The top cover doesn't close properly. I can hear a part rattling about inside this, so got a piece broken off. It won't turn, as with the rest of the machine. It's fairly badly seized up. I can't get the sprocket to turn, and also the solenoid will not push in, so that's frozen as well. So as ever, step one, get this cleaned. Need to be fairly careful with this. It's got a large solenoid, so I don't want to get any moisture in there, but I do need to clean a lot of congealed grease and dirt out of this. The top part especially is incredibly dirty. What I'm going to do to start with is remove the flap, so we can just take the spring out of this, and then this will just lift out. Okay, so as you can see, it's not terrible. I don't know how badly worn it is yet, but it doesn't look too bad. And the main thing is to get all this congealed grime off it. So once that's off, we can look at freeing it up. And there's not really a great deal of work to do on these, assuming the solenoid isn't burnt out. It doesn't look too bad. I can't see any signs of it having been severely overheated. It does look fairly dark, but they always tend to use dark wire on these, but there's no sign of the actual covering having overheated. Okay, so I'll go and get this cleaned, and we'll go from there. So after a really good clean, the reader's come up reasonably well. Still some work to do on it, but the next step is to test the contacts. Now after cleaning it did free up, so it now does rotate. So if I try to rotate the sprocket, it turns nice and freely. I've cleaned all the grease off. If you are working on one of these, it does not need smothering in grease. There was way too much on this, it was everywhere, and I think we've got an issue now that was caused by that, and that is some of the contacts aren't working. So the easiest way to test the contacts, it's a common bar connected to this black and white wire. So on the other end of the lead, I've got the test meter set to continuity mode. And what we can now do is, if you press the solenoid plunger, which is this now moves. Once I've cleaned it, it freed up. I haven't lubricated it yet, it's just cleaning it, freed it up. What you can do is go to each of the contacts in turn, and when you operate the solenoid armature, it should close the contact. That one's fine. On to the next one. That one's fine. On to the next one. That one's fine. On to the next one. And that one's not working. On to the next one. That one's not working. The next. That's not working. The next one. That's not working either. And the next one. And that's not working. So this was really dirty, and there was grease everywhere. This whole pivot bar, the rocker bar for the operation lever, was absolutely covered in grease, and directly underneath that are the switch contacts. And although you probably won't be able to see this, we've got the common bar here, and if we look down across where the contacts should be making contact or breaking contact, if I operate the solenoid, try and get some light down there, you can see the contacts moving. But on the common bar, which is the one that the lead's attached to, we can see, or at least I can see, there are black marks on there, so it looks like it's just the common, if that's grease and all sorts of stuff on the common bars. So you can take this out fairly easily, just a couple of screws and the whole thing will come out. I don't really want to do that. I'm going to try and get down in there and clean that with it in situ. Nothing abrasive, these are gold plated and you don't want to take the gold off, otherwise it will stop working after a few weeks when you put it back in the machine. I'm just going to try and get in there, clean it off and see if I can get all the contacts to work correctly. If they don't work cleanly and smoothly, then the reader will just put out garbage and you'll get all sorts of nonsense when you try and read a tape. So after carefully cleaning the contacts, so all I've been doing here is taking a cotton bud soaked in isopropyl alcohol, closing the solenoid and then just very carefully working the contact point side to side and putting a slight amount of pressure on. I'm not trying to wear through the gold, I'm just moving it side to side. It exposes the dirt, you can then hopefully remove it. It's looking a lot cleaner, I can't see any more marks on there. Okay, so what we should be able to do now is retest these. So that one's okay. That one's okay. So I'm holding the solenoid in here, so these should all be closed. And they're all working, so as long as they open and close when you operate the solenoid, then it should be fine. Okay, so I'll get the meter out of the way. I have also tested the solenoid to make sure it has continuity. Doesn't prove it's got any shorted turns, but what we can do now is apply power to the solenoid from the bench supply and see if it will operate the mechanism and whether it will close the contacts and advance the sprocket. I've got the solenoid connected to the bench supply, so when I now turn the supply on and off, the solenoid should pull in the armature. We should see the pins move up and protrude through the top plate, and then when I release the power, release the solenoid, we should see the sprocket advance one position. So I'll turn the supply on now. We can see that has indeed raised these. It's important these go down easily. If there's a lot of force on these and they're stuck, it can actually act as a punch and make holes in the paper. And also when we now turn the power off, we should see the pins all drop down and the sprocket go or advance one position. If any of the pins don't drop down, that can cause damage to the sprocket. It's only plastic and it's very easy to snap the teeth off this. So if the pins don't go down, it stops the paper moving, and that can cause, as I say, damage to the sprocket. So when I turn this off, we need to make sure all the pins go down and the sprocket moves, which it has done. So I'll do that a few times. And that's all this really does. Each time a pulse is applied to the solenoid, it tries to move the pins up. Any pins that come up, as we saw when I manually pressed the solenoid armature in, any pins that are allowed to come up allow the associated contact to close. If we look at the contact closest to us and I push the pin back down, you can see that it's opening the contact. Hopefully you can see it's opening the contact. So any pins that aren't allowed to pass through the punched paper cause the switch to stay open. Any pins that can move through the paper cause the associated contact to close, and that's how it reads the tape. It just applies a pulse to the solenoid. While that pulse is applied, it checks to see which switches are closed. When the power is then removed from the solenoid, the pins go down, the sprocket advances to the next row of holes in the paper, and the process repeats. So it just keeps repeating that over and over until you switch it off. Okay, we've got this lever here, and all that does is it closes the contact at the top here, so it effectively turns the reader on and off. So it's just a signal that goes through to the control pack to allow the solenoid to be activated. That's all this does. So this is now working. I just need to give it a bit of lubrication, and then this is ready to fit back into the machine. So one other thing I have to do, of course, is sort this out. It's turned chalky like a lot of the keys did. Unfortunately, some of the keys, and this as well, have developed cracks. They do that over time. There's not much you can do to prevent it. It's one of the problems of embedding metal in plastic. Same problem with the keys. But I will try and clean this up, make it a bit more presentable. I have cleaned the top cover as well, so I can refit that. I need to adjust it to make sure it's got the right spacing underneath to guide the paper properly. Obviously it doesn't want to be too tight, but it does have to hold the paper down onto the sprocket. One thing I haven't mentioned is this, and I said that this is the on-off switch. This is the paper detection, and what it does, it enables or disables the on-off switch. So if you turn the reader on but there's no paper, then the switch does not close because you've got this bar here holding it up. But when paper is detected, then the switch is allowed to close. So that might need adjusting. It's just really a case of adjusting it so that when there's no paper in the reader, this does nothing. But when you put paper in, you should start and stop the reader. Okay, so I'll get this done, get this straightened out as well, get it refitted and adjust it, and this can then go back into the ASR33. That's the reader ready to go back into the ASR33. I adjusted the top cover. It's actually badly scratched, so I polished this up as well to get all the scratches out of it. It's come up quite nicely. And it's looking quite good. So this is now up to the point where it can be put back into the machine, and hopefully it's going to give us the correct results. The switches all seem to work, the solenoid works, the advance works, all the pins move freely, and this is now just really a case of dropping it back into the ASR33. It will need adjusting to line up with the top cover once that's refitted. But I can plug it in and we can see if it can actually read a tape. Okay, I've bolted the reader back into the ASR33. You can see I haven't tried to adjust it yet, it's still loose. There are some screws on the underside of the chassis that are used to line this with the outer cover. But it's now bolted in. I've connected it up. On some of these early ASR33s, the punch and the reader were options. And you'll see when we look at the outer cover that the cover itself came in multiple parts. The first machine I showed in these videos had a single piece cover, or at least the main cover was in one piece, but on this one it's in several pieces, and you'll see what I mean when we come to look at that. But part of that means that some of the electronics are also optional. One of the optional parts is the bit at the back here, so that's this unit. That's this unit, and that normally resides in the bottom case, the stand that the ASR33 sits on. I've removed it just so I can run this on the bench, but that was an option that was fitted whenever the reader was fitted, but it's part of the control interface for the reader. But of course that needs to be plugged in, otherwise the reader won't do anything. Okay, I've got the reader connected up, otherwise I've got it connected to the main unit, and I've got a short piece of tape here, so we'll feed this into the reader. So we'll just open the top cover, pop the tape into the reader, and what we should be able to do now is put the ASR33 into local mode, toggle the start switch for the reader, and we should get some activity on the printer. So I'll switch the ASR33 on. It's going to make some noise as usual, and what I'll do now is try turning on the reader. So as you can see, stop the bell from ringing. So as you can see, it does seem to be doing something. I'm just going to try and run that back through. Okay, we'll try that again. And once again it seems to be working. Okay, what I'm going to do next, I won't do it on camera, but I've got some test tapes that I use to exercise these machines, and it just essentially runs through the entire character set repeatedly. I'm going to put that into the reader. I'm going to leave it running, run it through maybe 20 or 30 times, just really to fully exercise the ASR33 mechanics. I want to get all the parts moving freely. I'll then re-lubricate it, run the tape back through another 10 or 20 times, and by the time I've done that, hopefully this will start to work correctly. So in the next video I will have done that, and I'll see if I find any issues with this. I'll stop and flag them up and post a video about it. One issue I did have that I haven't yet mentioned, I still had a problem with the punch. I'll just zoom you in to have a quick look at that before we finish this video. Okay, now these ASR33s were built down to a price. They were made very cheaply. There were many thousands made. It's surprising that so few still exist, but they were made very cheaply. Some parts are very nicely engineered, other parts were made a little bit too cheaply, and one of those is the paper guide for the punch. And one of the problems with them is the age. I've seen it a few times, is when you press this lever, this is meant to release the tension on the pinch roller on the punch. And the idea is that when you press it down, it allows you to easily feed paper right through so that you can load it when you come to replace the paper. So you should be able to just feed it through like that. But I couldn't do that. What was happening when I pressed this down, this entire guide was racking, so it's in several pieces. There's a loose plate on the bottom, which is the bit that we blued, and then you have a roller at the back, a couple of cross pieces, but the entire thing was basically racking when I pressed this down, and it was causing the two rollers, the one at the back and the one at the front, to pinch onto the paper, so I couldn't feed it through. It was fine when I first started feeding it, and it was fine if I pressed the other side of the guide, but you can't get to that from the outside of the machine. This is normally operated from a button on the outside of the ASR33, and then you feed the paper in from the outside of the case, so you don't really have the option to come in here and start pressing various parts of this. So it was a bit of a problem. Once the paper was loaded, it was fine, it punched without problems, because as soon as you release this whole thing kind of freed off. As soon as you press this, the paper just jammed up and you couldn't move it. So what I've done is I've made a completely new roller for the back. I've blued it again, or blacked it, and the idea is a tighter fitting roller, so it works, and it kind of supports the entire guide. It looks pretty much identical to the original, and I will be keeping the original roller with the unit. Whoever gets it will get this as well, and if they want to return it to original spec, they can just refit this. But the whole point is that as it now is, it works, and you can press this lever and load the paper. One other point while we're talking about the punch is I've hardly ever seen the Chad chute properly installed. Let's going to turn the unit round a little bit. Okay, so on the punch you have this guide here, and there's a kind of a finger that pokes towards the front of the machine. Now the idea is that the end of that finger goes into the end of the Chad tube, and that makes sure that the end of the Chad tube is above the exit port. So when you're fitting these, you slide, although you can't see it, I'm sliding this end of the tube onto that. So I'm just going to move the camera. In fact, I'll turn the unit around so you can see this a lot more clearly. Okay, so hopefully you can see this. There's this guide here, and the end of it goes into the Chad tube, and you can see that then kind of automatically locates the Chad tube above this exit port, and then when you hook the front end of the tube back onto the punch, so that it's like that, the whole thing is kind of captive at both ends, and also the end of it is in the correct location to feed Chad out into the Chad box. So I just thought I'd mention that in case you've seen one of these and this tube is just kind of loose inside the machine and it fills the machine up with Chad and causes all sorts of problems. Okay, that's it for this video. In the next one I will have run through some initial testing, I will have exercised the machine, and we'll see what problems crop up, if any.